Good afternoon. I hope you've had a good lunch and welcome back to the plenary. My name is Jerry Velasquez. I'm the moderator of session 3.3.2, Funded Activities, Lessons from Implementation, Adaptive Management, and Evaluation. So this session will address common issues, challenges, and adaptive management solutions, as well as key lessons from the implementation of the Green Climate Fund's portfolio projects and programs, including the role of the GCF's independent units. I hope through this session, you'll also know more about our independent units. I would like to introduce our panelists, and as I call them, I would like to ask that they come up to the stage. First, we have Keith Nichols, who is the Head of Program Development and Management Unit of 5Cs. Keith, are you here? Please come to the stage. Next, I would like to call on Karen Cerning, Portfolio Manager, GCF Oversight at GIZ. Please, Karen, you could take your seat. Next, I would like to ask Katarzyna Lejsuk, who is a restructuring specialist at the Division of Portfolio Management at the GCF Secretariat. Welcome. Next, we have Ms. Preksha Kumar, Registrar and Case Officer at the GCF's Independent Redress Mechanism. I think, Preksha, are you joining online? Yes, Preksha is online. Next, we have Albert Lihalakha, Deputy Head at GCF's Independent Integrity Unit. Albert, please. Thank you very much. Next, we have Andreas Ruman, who is the Head at Interim at the GCF's Independent Evaluation Unit. Andreas. And then we have Unica Ore, Monitoring and Evaluation Specialist at the Division of Portfolio Management at the Green Climate Fund Secretariat. So I think we are going to have a very interesting discussion. We have a large group of specialists from a broad range of backgrounds. We have both participants on site and remote participants. I would like to encourage both of you, both those that are online and also present here, to kindly submit your questions online in Whova. We will be monitoring that so that then we can pick up any questions from there later on at the Q&A session. So firstly, we're going to go now to our panelists. We'll start off with Keith Nichols. Keith, the 5Cs is currently implementing one funded activity from which was, I think, from January 2016. Very early in the GCF, yes. 2019, okay, 2019. Could you share with us your experiences in dealing with some of the challenges you encountered and how you might have dealt with those to ensure that the activity was not adversely affected? Keith?
Thank you, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of our experiences in working with one particular funding activity, which was valued at $45.2 million, which went $7.6 million from the GCF. The rest is co-financing from the Barbados Water Authority. This is a water project in Barbados. And in 2019, of course, 2019 is well known as the year in which we discovered COVID-19. And of course, everything cascaded as a consequence of the impacts of that. And as every other project, this was impacted by COVID-19. And some of the lessons were, you design a project, you've got your budget in place, and you've got your suite of activities in defining components, only to have it significantly impacted by the major event, COVID-19. So apart from the lockdowns, so we're implementing for the first year of the project, everything's working smoothly. And then we end up in the COVID-19 situation countries are locked down, no one is allowed in or out of the countries, and we can't implement. That demands a lot of resources, thinking, time, and effort to figure workarounds. You've got a limited time frame within which to work. And yes, even with the GCF say, fine, it's a force majeure situation. We will allow you some extra time in the case you require. But we can't just sit around twiddling our thumbs. We have to find ways around those barriers. So one of the things we had to do in this instance was to attempt to fast track or bring forward some of those softer activities where we couldn't allow persons on the ground in those countries. In Barbados, for example, no one's allowed in or out. Consultants couldn't visit the country. Consultants couldn't leave the country. The problem is we saw significant price increases in that time frame. We saw the supply chain impacts. We couldn't get commodities in the country in time. We couldn't get consultants. For some reason, COVID-19 impacted the availability of consultants to do some of the work. And we couldn't get consultants. So we had to readjust terms of reference because price increases meant that we couldn't afford some of the items that were planned. So we had to redefine terms of reference. We had to redefine the way we engage with the work on the ground, which couldn't happen during that period. So we were challenged to find the softer elements, secure the work permits for those persons who required when the situation returned to normal to get into the country to do some of the work those programs. We had to seek the permissions. I used the opportunity to get the permissions to access the various sites of investments. And these are the softer things we had to bring forward that were not planned at the time, but we had to. There were procurement challenges as well. So we're trying to get commodities from Europe, for example, and all of a sudden it's not available because of the supply chain disruptions, the increase in prices and the exponential increase in prices. That's still happening today for reasons other than COVID. And we have to look now to other markets to bring on board the commodities that we require, water tankers, generators, solar PV panels, and that sort of thing. We had to look towards China to see if we could get some of the commodities in. And then the cost of freight and shipping increased exponentially as well. So we were working against a fixed budget. The fortunate thing was we had to go back to the GCF to realign our expectations, realign the allocations or the budgets to the real world realities at the time. And GCF was very accommodating. I think we all understood what the challenges were and how we had to manipulate a maneuver around those barriers and yet not detract from the goals and objectives of the project and still try to implement within the same time frame. So procurement, from the procurement perspective, and like I said earlier, all of a sudden, the consultant's not available. And then we try to find workarounds. We got failed procurements for 3 times or thereabouts. We weren't able to get the quality expertise that we required. In one particular instance, and we require, if the value of investment is significantly high, we need some form of security, a performance bond or something. And we couldn't land the performance bond in that instance. In one particular instance, it was a significant investment as well. And so it's, with all of those challenges, trying to retain some integrity of the budget and the components and the nature of the investments against all the difficult environment of COVID, increased prices and everything else, it appeared insurmountable at that time. Fortunately, with the passage of time, we were able to have things work in our favor. And we're still going through some of those challenges because we're still suffering from the increase in prices, the commodity prices. We've had to revise terms of reference, maybe reduce the scope in some instances. And those adjustments are continuous. Now, this is probably considered a normal part of project management, yes. We had never anticipated those types of challenges before. There were significant disruptions, global events where nothing could move, nothing happened for a while. We couldn't get commodities because of supply chain disruptions. We couldn't get the services required to do some of the work on the grounds because all of a sudden, consultants couldn't travel. Countries were locked down. And it's unprecedented, but it's a type of situation that we're likely to face. Fortunately, we didn't have extreme weather disruptions as we did in 2017 and 2019 with Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. We didn't have those to compound the issue. But ultimately, these are some of the barriers and the challenges that we face in times like these where you have the unprecedented events. And that's it for now. Thanks.
Many thanks, Keith. In fact, listening to you, I know that some of my other colleagues are also thinking about it, asking you already the question, what would you do differently in your next project? But keep that in your mind. I think they'll ask you when their time comes. I think, learning from these kind of experiences is very important so that we don't do the same again in the future. Next, we would like to ask Karen, another of our partners. What are the challenges that GIZ face during implementation regarding your own rules and procedures, which are already in place, and GCF's requirements?
Okay, thank you very much for having me here. I'm excited to sit on this panel today, focusing on implementation of projects funded by the GCF and having the opportunity to share lessons learned and best practices. And it was already great to hear the challenges you faced in Barbados, because we faced very similar challenges in our project in Grenada. But this time I want to talk about other challenges we faced in project implementation. And before jumping in, I would like to elaborate a bit on the context of our work. GIZ has over 50 years of experience in technical cooperation, and our main commissioning party is the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, but we also work for other commissioning partners like the other ministries in Germany and the European Union. And for this reason, GIZ has a strong set of rules and procedures and systems in place to implement projects with a high level of due diligence. We also have a GIZ management model for sustainable development called Capacity Works, and that model helps heads of projects to implement the project on a day-by-day basis. So GIZ was accredited by the GCF in 2016, and the accreditation became effective in 2019. We were accredited as an international accredited entity, and we also work as executing entity. And at the moment, we have 4 projects under implementation. So back in 2019, we created a very small unit called Oversight Unit, and this unit is at GIZ headquarters. It's responsible for reporting and evaluation, finance management, risk management and compliance, environmental safeguards, gender, communication, knowledge management, and quality control. And the challenge we actually faced was that it was not clear to us whether we could use our own systems to answer all the questions the GCF may ask at a time, and we were not sure about what we must pass on to other executing entities. And I don't speak about the OECD rules and procedures for evaluation, for example, because we do comply with them. I really speak about a lot of nuances and details and different definition and requests by the GCF and specific requirements. And what we definitely not wanted to have is 2 parallel systems running in one project just to meet the requirements of different donors. So we asked ourselves what to do, and I would like to take the evaluation as an example. So we really deep dived into our evaluation system, down to the evaluation matrix. We really checked all the questions in the GIZ evaluation matrix, and we matched these questions with the questions we found in the manual of the GCF. I think they were in the annex of the programming manual. And we did that together with our GIZ independent evaluation unit. And it took us quite a while really to come up with a kind of adapted system, taking GIZ questions and GCF questions. And this step-by-step approach was time intensive, but on the other hand, we also learned a lot. We had a very good exchange with other units in GIZ, and we also have a very permanent exchange with our task manager at GCF. So we've got guidance on what we should do, and finally the system we adapted was approved by the GCF. So now we are waiting for our first 3 midterm evaluation reports, and we are looking very much forward to get feedback on them by the GCF. So that is one experience I would like to share with you. We actually proceeded in the same way for the environmental and social safeguard system, for the risk management system, and other systems we have in place, and where we should meet GCF requirements.
Okay, many thanks for that, Karen. I think it links now very well to the next speaker, Katarzyna from GCF Secretariat. After hearing 2 of our partners, Katarzyna, now on their experience on change adaptive management, what do you think are the critical success factors for adaptive management, and how and what should the unaccredited entity prepare for the submission of a change request?
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you to all honorable guests and colleagues for joining us for this session. So let me start by giving a brief definition of what adaptive management is in the context of GCF-funded activity. By adaptive management, we mean introducing changes to either project design or implementation arrangements in response to changes in the operating context of the project. And now, what is critical to make this process successful? From my experience at GCF, but also in other institutions, I believe we can distinguish 4 critical factors. The first factor would be the process to be very proactive rather than retroactive. What we sometimes encounter here at GCF is that accredited entities approach us with requests to approve changes that had already been implemented into a project. And obviously, this is a difficult process, and it can have severe consequences for the project. First of all, it would mean that most likely the assessment on the Secretariat side would be prolonged, and it would take time to have the approval of such a request. And GCF might also decide to suspend disbursement while this assessment is ongoing. Second of all, in case the GCF would decide that this change is not approved, this would have severe consequences for the project, obviously, including the need to reimburse funds that had been allocated to ineligible expenditure, for example. So in order to avoid all of that, what my advice to the AEs is to definitely engage with your GCF focal point as early into the process as possible. Make contact, discuss the outline of the changes you want to introduce, discuss the rationale, and seek guidance on what will be necessary for the assessment of this change request. Speaking of the assessment, I think one critical point is for the assessment to be as holistic as possible, because no change into the project design can be introduced without considering the context of the project implementation, and also without considering the underlying design assumptions. An example of that would be if you want to introduce changes to the technical design of a project, these not only need to be assessed from an engineering perspective, but also we need to consider implication on budget, implication on safeguards assessments, and implication on timeline of the implementation of the project. Another important factor that the AEs should be considering when preparing for submitting a change request is the climate rationale. How does the change you want to introduce align with the impact you want to achieve with the project and with the intended objectives and outcomes? Or conversely, what would have happened if the change is not approved? How would that reflect on the ability of the project to deliver on the agreed objectives and outcomes? Once this kind of assessment is done, we're ready to submit the documents. And at this point, you would probably want to hear from me what kind of documents would be necessary for the GCF to consider an amendment request. And unfortunately, there is no one-fits-all answer to that question. But things that need to be considered is obviously the content of the request and whether a change you are requesting is likely to be considered major under the policy on restructuring and cancellation of the GCF. I would definitely encourage every accredited entity that is planning to submit a change request to go to the GCF operational documents website and type in restructuring in the search engine. That way you will find both the policy on restructuring and cancellation and the relevant template for the restructuring proposal. And these documents will give you a good understanding of how the process would look like and what are the necessary documents. In any case, as always, it's very helpful to consult your GCF focal point, as they will be able to guide you through the process and they will definitely be able to provide you the information on what kind of assessments they would be looking for when making an assessment of the restructuring or the change proposal. An important thing to note, and something that the AEs sometimes forget about, is that any change request needs to be consulted with the relevant NDA or focal point. And for major changes, this assessment would need to confirm that the restructuring proposal or the change request does not impact the non-objection letter. And lastly, I think that the most critical point in all adaptive management processes, it's for the dialogue between the accredited entity and the GCF to be transparent and open, because adaptive management processes are non-linear. These are iterative processes. So this requires both parties, actually all stakeholders at the table, to be able to and open to consider counter proposals and to work together to finding solutions that are acceptable to all stakeholders. And with that, I wanted to thank you for your attention and for listening to my presentation. And I'm happy to take further questions during the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Many thanks for that, Katarzyna. I think it's good that you noted that often the challenges we face is when change has already been implemented and not informed. But maybe there's also that question from some of our participants here: what kind of change do they have to inform us? You know, what is that trigger? How big a change should they tell us? But I think you already answered. There should be a transparent conversation with the GCF, and that in any case need to happen anyway. But maybe you could consider that as an advice if it's written in our operations manual in any case. Now we switch on to our independent units, because I think we also need to learn from the experience that they've had in some of our projects. First, we go to Preksha from our independent redress mechanism. Preksha, who's online, I hope we could show her. The question to you is, what lessons from the independent redress mechanism cases can be used to help avoid complaints during the implementation process? Preksha.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you, panelists. Very pleased to be here and to be able to participate in this conversation. I'm going to take a moment to just introduce what the independent redress mechanism does. The independent redress mechanism is one of 3 accountability mechanisms within the Green Climate Fund. And the word accountability can be very scary for many people. It can also raise a lot of anxiety, the question of grievances or complaints, what that might mean for project implementation and operations. I think the role of the independent redress mechanism and similar grievance redress mechanisms, the goal is to destigmatize what accountability might mean in the normal operation of projects. Even the best designed project, even the most sophisticated, the most up-to-date project designs and operations can have unintended consequences. And when these unintended consequences happen, it's really important that there is a fair, transparent, and effective mechanism to handle problems as they arise. A common question we get as a redress mechanism is what happens when a complaint is filed? Does that mean disbursement is stopped? Does that mean the project comes to a standstill? It does not. And I think that is a very key understanding and learning that the GCF, through its funding model and through its accreditation agreements, recognizes. Each accredited entity or each entity accredited with the GCF is required to have an effective and functioning grievance redress mechanism. And the reason for that is, and I want to highlight that at least for the IRM, it's a key priority that there is an increase in capacity as well as successful operation of grievance redress mechanisms, not merely at the level of institutions, but also in the level of projects. Because having a successful grievance redress mechanism and one wherein people are where people feel confident and unafraid to approach project staff or implementers to share their concerns and proactively work together to find solutions, that is the best possible outcome in finding ways to address grievances and incorporating those concerns in how projects are being implemented. So I do want to highlight that the independent redress mechanism works actively in building capacity through our capacity building activities, working directly with the staff of grievance redress mechanisms at DAEs, specifically direct access entities. The reason why it is especially important in the context of direct access entities is because having a grievance redress mechanism closest to where projects happen, where people are from the place where the project is taking place, where they're familiar with the context, the issues, in many ways, that's the speediest and most cost-effective way to identify problems, address them early on, and prevent these issues from snowballing into a major issue that then might pose reputational risks for the institutions and also affect the implementation of a project. Now, that said, the independent redress mechanism also exists to address complaints and grievances by people who believe they may have been negatively impacted by projects. And the IRM recently, there are 2 cases from which the IRM, I think, would like to share some learnings where there is a role, and I want to specifically highlight the role of accredited entities, project implementers in bringing about the resolution in these 2 cases. One is a complaint that the IRM received about a project in Morocco relating to concerns that the complainant had around consultations, a lack of consultations and a lack of access to information. Now, in the processing of this complaint, the IRM spoke with all parties, and complainants indicated a willingness to engage in problem solving, which is one of the ways in which cases can be handled. Problem solving or dispute resolution is a process wherein all stakeholders may engage voluntarily in finding a solution, engaging in dialogue to reach a mutually satisfying resolution to those issues. And in this case, that worked rather successfully, even in the context of the pandemic. The IRM, like other entities and also like the GCF, transitioned our work online, including working on mediation, which is a very delicate process, but it was still successful. And ultimately, the complainant decided to close the complaint because the mediation process facilitated a dialogue where they received reassurances that their concerns would be addressed and that the AE and the project implementers would work proactively to address that. In many ways, this is the ideal outcome in terms of how a grievance may be handled, is finding a solution that is agreeable to all parties and one that improves the effectiveness of the project. A second example, I think I'd like to highlight is a complaint received on a project that the GCF financed in Peru. And this is a very interesting case because it was the very first GCF project actually. And the issues that were raised were very important in the context of the kinds of operations and project activities that happen, including in impacting vulnerable populations, in this case, indigenous peoples. Now, the project was approved prior to the GCF having its Indigenous Peoples policy adopted, as well as its operational guidelines on the Indigenous Peoples policy. So what does that mean? A complaint was received, and it was about lack of free, prior, informed consent as it relates to Indigenous peoples, a well-recognized right. But it had to do with something that it had to do with a project that was approved prior to the GCF adopting a policy. So how would you address something like this? And in this case, I want to highlight, that there was a lot of proactive steps taken by the AE and the GCF Secretariat to carry out remedial actions. And what that means is using some of the existing kind of processes around the Indigenous Peoples policy to address concerns that this project raised. So the development of guidance on free, prior, informed consent impacted not only this one project, but all of GCF projects. And the accredited entity and GCF Secretariat worked in close collaboration over a number of years to ensure that the 4 undertakings that they had promised to carry out to bring the project back into compliance were carried out. The project is still being monitored, but at least at this stage, 3 of those 4 undertakings have been completed. So this is just a snapshot and just two lessons learned from complaints that the IRM has received. I want to come back to that point on what it means for addressing grievances, what it means when complaints are received. I don't think accredited entities, project implementers should in any way feel afraid about the fact that a complaint exists. The fact that a complaint exists, at least if more than one complaint exists, in my opinion, if there's a grievance mechanism that has been receiving many complaints, it's more often than not this sign that you're doing the right thing, that people are approaching these mechanisms because they have trust and faith in having a space for their concerns to be heard. And ultimately, that will improve the effectiveness of project operations and in the delivery of their goals. So that's it for me. I look forward to any questions or you may have about this or related issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Raksha. I was furiously trying to write all of those lessons learned. I hope it's written somewhere because it's very valuable. I think hopefully it's compiled maybe in the IRM website. But I think those are very important tips for our partners to take note. We move on to one of our other independent units, this time to our independent integrity unit. So it's this question is for Albert. Albert, can you please tell us what early signs or integrity red flags should project managers look out for in the implementation process? And related to that, what available mechanism should our accredited entities activate to prevent or address red flags and integrity breaches?
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We do appreciate the opportunity to come and present and give you a little bit of information about what the IAU does and respond to some of your questions. If I may just start off with providing a little bit of background about what the IAU does and who we are, just to give a little bearing to those of us that are not familiar with the functions of the Independent Integrity Unit. The IAU was established by the board of the Green Climate Fund under the authority of the governing instrument. We're mandated to conduct investigations into allegations of fraud, corruption, and other prohibited practices. In the MDB world, these are sanctionable practices or sanctionable offenses. We also have a mandate to carry out preventative activities, and this is to seek ways to identify potential areas that are vulnerable to issues of integrity violations and seek to remediate these collaboratively with the Secretariat and with our partners. Although we do have an operational independence, we do work very closely in collaboration with Secretariat colleagues to ensure that we deliver the services that are necessary to assist our relevant stakeholders. Now, the topic here we're talking about really is somewhat touchy from time to time, depending on where you're coming from. So I'll try and provide a little bit of context in terms of what cases look like and what you can anticipate before I do jump into providing a response for you, Jerry. There was a recent global study on occupational fraud and abuse by the ACFE that found that 5% of revenues are lost to fraud and corruption every year. And it takes an approximately 12 months before fraud is detected. And the median loss for each one of these cases is about $117,000. And in 21% of these cases, it was over $1 million. Now, in over 2,000 cases that were reviewed in 133 countries, it was found that organizations lost over $3 billion. The biggest one of these issues here is corruption. This was the most common scheme in every global region. By any measure, this is, of course, a staggering amount. If by extrapolation, we seek to kind of transition that into climate financing, whose ambition is to mobilize over $100 billion, simple math indicates that we would be losing about $5 billion a year. Now, this is, of course, if we want to be a little bit optimistic and say we've got all our ducks in a row and got all our policies together, even if we say we've lost about 1% of that $100 billion, we're still looking at $1 billion of loss. Now, this can cripple projects and adversely affect the intended beneficiaries and undermines our climate initiatives. And we know that corruption and fraud and any of these integrity violations can happen at any kind of given stage of a project life cycle. Now, the other elements that are, vulnerable to corruption or other areas that you would find these integrity violations would be in asset misappropriation and financial misstatements. But corruption still remains the biggest challenge that projects can expect to come across. Now, program managers should be cognizant of areas of vulnerabilities and look for red flags, particularly around conflicts of interest, procurement irregularities, bid rigging, collusion, maybe poor poor quality project results. There are myriad of other red flags that can be observed specific to any given situation. The biggest challenge, however, is detection. How do we find out about integrity violations? According to the same study, 42% of frauds and corruption are detected by tips from whistleblowers. That said, therefore, it's critical for organizations to implement effective processes to receive and evaluate tips from internal and external stakeholders. At the GCF, for example, we've got a hotline service that is available 24/7 in multiple languages. Complainants can provide a report through web service, web form. They can also send us an email. So we've got multiple avenues for receipt of complaints. Another really important element that managers or organizations can take on is implementing effective processes to receive and evaluate these tips. And with recurrent and reinforcing training to staff and stakeholders on how to identify and report potential issues. It is imperative for organizations to implement widely and communicate widely policies that clearly articulate unacceptable practices. This forms also the basis for administrative and legal actions if it does come to it. The study found that only about 60, maybe a little over 60% of organizations out there have integrity-related policies. So it means that 40% of organizations are still vulnerable and don't have the legal basis or administrative basis to address issues of integrity violations. At the GCF, we've got the Integrity Policy Framework, which is available on the IAU page of the GCF website. Now, organizations can consider instituting deterrent mechanisms such as surprise audits, investigative responses, proactive data analytics. Now, to expand a little more broadly, I'd like to speak a little bit about what we do here at the GCF and specifically at the IIU. Through our data analytics capacity, we've developed machine learning modules to help us identify red flags in GCF projects and identify any potential areas of vulnerability that we would need to address. We've commenced our proactive integrity reviews on GCF projects, which allow us an opportunity to collaboratively work with stakeholders and identify those areas that may have certain gaps in integrity-related issues and work to collaboratively address those. We're now working to engage with civil society, which has the benefit of empowering beneficiaries, providing greater transparency, monitoring and accountability, and more effective project execution. In our discussions yesterday with our DAE colleagues, counterparties have a lot of obligations. And when it comes to integrity violations, contractual agreements mandate that our counterparties will conduct the investigative response and then provide the GCF with the report necessary, and the IAU will evaluate to make sure that those investigations took place in an appropriate manner. Now, we also do recognize that our counterparties, they're not in the business of investigations. Now, this is where our investigation support and advisory services do provide value to our partners and stakeholders. Now, we also have other areas that we can help. This would include joint investigations, providing guidance, maybe potentially peer review reports. And we can also provide support in other areas, specifically capacity building and technical assistance. Now, we do have policies and standards at the GCF that mandate support for stakeholders in this regard. We would partner with the GCF and make sure that we provide the requisite services to our stakeholders. Another example that we can provide services is the advisory services, where we can help with consultations on conflict of interest policies, the development of your respective policies, as well as any other investigation related matters. We're looking to initiate our peer learning alliance which is quite similar to the CPDAE initiative, where we put like organizations together in an effort to try and elevate everybody to a certain level of standard that provides them an opportunity to be more effective in their execution and to meet the requirements of the GCF. Another really important area is the proactive integrity reviews. This is something that will become a mainstay of the IIU and is part of the long-term strategy, risk mitigation strategy of the GCF. So as we conduct these proactive integrity reviews, it would be beneficial if the partners work with us so that we can identify potential gaps and work together to remediate those issues. It is the II's view that we are a natural partner of our stakeholders, and therefore we encourage partners to reach out to us for consultations, reach out to us if you need any guidance. We're available. Our contact information is available on the website, and we do appreciate this time. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for that, Albert. And when you say that reach out when there is some questions, they don't necessarily have to go to our accredited partner. They could directly go to IIU. They could go directly.
Sorry, you could go directly to the IIU.
Okay, thank you. So then we move on to another independent unit. In this case, the independent evaluation unit. And for Andreas, can you please tell us what the evaluations are telling us about the key barriers to implementation of GCF projects? And also linked to that, what are some of the opportunities for GCF to improve project implementation?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry, and thanks, colleagues. I'm really pleased to be able to speak here on some of the emerging findings that we have and the conclusions that we draw from these findings with regards to the second performance review of the GCF that we're currently undertaking. As per board-approved terms of reference, the IIU in itself and the IIU's mandate is to directly inform the decision-making of the board. And I think it's important to mention that to identify in what way we're trying to help the fund to think about, some of the shortcomings and some of the challenges that we're currently perceiving, not only in implementation, but also in other parts of the fund. So with that, the objective of this review is obviously to help the fund to revisit some of these processes, policies and modalities, and inform the development of a new strategic plan for the GCF2 period, and ultimately improve activities and support in the fight against climate change. So from an institutional perspective, and you may all know that, just to say, we know that the GCF is established with the aim to promote paradigm shift towards low emission and climate resilient development pathways. And while doing so, it also takes into account the needs of the developing countries, in particular the vulnerable countries to the adverse effects of climate change. So one of an early component of the second performance review was indeed a study, which we call a synthesis study, covering all previous evaluations, GCF documentation and reviews, as well as external literature during the GCF1 period. And the synthesis report identified 5 provisions that are discernible from the mandate as well as from the evidence collected in the GCF1 period. I won't go through all of them, but I just wanted to mention them. So we're looking at the question of how does the GCF provide access and what do we learn from that? And how is the GCF positioning itself with its programming? How are we looking at implementation and in particular in achieving results and managing risks? And the institutional architecture and how does that relate to the programming that we're currently undertaking? So most of these aspects are very strongly linked to the question of challenges observed in implementation. And so allow me to just focus on 3 quick areas, so access, programming, and managing risks and results, before coming to some learnings from the ground. So on access, the evaluation team found that despite the high-level recognition of the importance of entities, accredited entities of the fund still lags clarity and clear strategy with regards for accreditation. So who are we partnering and why? So the process itself on accreditation is still somewhat protracted and inefficient. So we found that median times for entities to receive board approval for accreditation during the GCF1 period has actually increased to an average of 1,321 days for entities to be accredited. And that's quite concerning. From the perspective of direct access, we have positive feedback. So direct access is growing rapidly. We actually found that during the GCF1 period, nearly 66% of all accreditation approvals were directly linked to direct access. And that is good to know. And we found as well that with that, more funding proposals are coming. So the funding proposed approved to direct access entities has increased to 23%. Again, a remarkable result earlier this year. But then again, direct access remains somewhat limited when we looked deeper. So looking at the question, just to illustrate that, 66% of all accredited direct access entities do not have a funding proposal with the GCF currently. And furthermore, 20 of those do not even have a concept node. So 20%, apologies, do not even have a concept node in the pipeline with the GCF. So they're essentially not accessing any of our finance. Reasons may be manifold, but again, we think it's important to note these shortcomings generally. From the programming perspective, so now moving on from access to programming with the GCF, we all know that GCF uses a suite of operational modalities to support programming cycles, such as readiness, planning support, direct project and program requests, all the way to appraisal and approval processes for projects. What we found is that the simplified approval process, which many of you know, is valid. It is an important element of the fund, but unfortunately, its unmet potential to streamline processes and to reach different audiences is still a concern. When we look at the proposal development, we find in particular with reference to the private sector facility, and you may know that there's a private sector conference ongoing here as well. The private sector facility has limited accredited entities available to do business with. In addition to this, approval is relatively slow, and the engagement of direct access entities is relatively speaking very low. So here, programmatic approaches are often cited as one of the key features and opportunities for the fund. Moving from the gaps that we've identified with direct access, it's also the question of effectiveness of the readiness program and the RPSP program and the project preparation facility. The effectiveness indeed is not well known by the fund, and that is because of the lack of systematic and regular monitoring. We do know that the RMF did not provide for the monitoring of the support programs, but the Secretariat has since looked into finalizing and implementing a results management framework for such program. So again, here we're currently not able to speak on that, but we have high hopes that this will improve later in the year. Another issue that we see is we noticed that, of course, we have an equitable balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, but we're still struggling to somewhat reach the most vulnerable and least ready countries for the much needed support in climate change adaptation. So 59 of the most vulnerable countries are yet to receive their first adaptation project. Again, in terms of the pipeline development, we found that country programs and entity work programs are not fully identifying the areas of highest impact or paradigm shift potential. And both are insufficiently aligned. So both the country programs as well as the entity programs are insufficiently aligned and then create tensions over prioritizing projects, and thus do not really adequately deliver on what they stated, on their stated aims. Again, the processes in approval of projects is perceived by the colleagues on the ground as very bureaucratic and lengthy and somewhat inconsistent. So let me then just really move over to the question of what do we do with the implementation and the managing for risks and results? Here we can applaud to our colleagues at the Secretariat, most prominently here, my colleague to my left from DPM, that the IRMF has been an important step to guarantee managing for results in the future. Initial reviews by our office has shown and identified improvements over the results management framework that was initially drawn up in the beginning of in the setup of this fund. But at the same time, we recognize that the IRMF will only be applied for projects after 2022, which will lead to challenges that need to be overcome in the monitoring and reporting frameworks due to inconsistent methods, risks identified, and problems with aggregation of results. As per business model, the AE holds the first level responsibility, and that has always been mentioned in various settings of the fund. So it's the first level responsibilities for project implementation. The Secretariat takes the second level diligence, if you like. However, the Secretariat at this current moment has limited tools that are fully operationalized for control and compliance function. So we found that in particular, managing for risks during implementation is very limited. Lastly, the Secretariat adopted a knowledge management strategy and action plan, which was long overdue. However, again, we see that the systems and practices remain nascent. There's responsibilities are unclear, and there are limited knowledge sharing opportunities that are felt by the accredited entities on the ground. So what does this all mean for implementation? Look, considering these learnings from access programming as well as the managing for results, we found that the project portfolio remains relatively nascent. To illustrate that, 40 out of 109 projects, so 37%, reported on their third implementation year in 2020. And that's quite a low number. The number is expected to rise with the annual progress reports for 2021 coming in. So we expect a number around 67 projects, which would only get us a little bit closer to the 50%. Even if we consider disbursement rates as an indicator for progress in implementation, and that is until B33, we found that the GCF has approved 10.7 billion USD. And that's obviously quite a success. However, only 2.7 billion USD were dispersed, which equates to 25% disbursement rate. Again, the reasons for this are manifold. We looked at a review of the annual progress reports, and we found that 98 of the 109 projects, so almost all of them, had at least one challenge with project implementation, totaling 344 challenges received by the office of the GCF. Most frequent challenges were in the category of environmental and social considerations. So we've heard the presentation of the IRM before, so there are strong links there. Second consideration, and as most frequent challenges, were financial considerations and procurement. And lastly, also political risks were named as some of the challenges perceived in implementation. Lastly, let me give you another number just to spice it up a little bit. 31 projects displayed a delay in more than 50% of their activities. So again, while there might be only a few challenges for some projects, others are struggling quite heavily. We contrasted that with what we've learned on the ground. And here again, stakeholders identified in our country case studies of the second performance review, several considerations to mitigate some of these challenges. And what was basically asked by those stakeholders were more flexibility in the application of policies, approaches vis-a-vis the local context. Secondly, more opportunities to allow for adaptive management, defining what change in a project truly means, and And also considering that the lengthy appraisal processes that I spoke about earlier do not consider changing landscapes. In layman's terms, basically most of the projects are already outdated once they are approved due to the long and lengthy appraisal processes. Another consideration was transaction costs and coordination costs, and I believe we've heard this from our speaker here in Barbados as well, that that is considered a hurdle for most projects. And lastly, more clarity on processes and responsibilities to ensure predictability. And that was one of the key requests from some of those stakeholders that we've heard, more predictability with the GCF. So what are we concluding from this? And here, let me only make 3 very quick points. So going forward, we would argue that GCF should consider clarifying the GCFs and the partners' roles in countries. There's still a relative unclarity around what sort of roles different actors in our partnerships play, and how we can better serve and meet the country needs with the partners that we are partnering with. Here it also links to clarifying the role of country programming processes, and in particular the future role of country programs and entity work programs. A second consideration was the further improve the efficiency of GCF processes and processing times. It's truly an urgency and climate urgency that we are finding ourselves in, and we cannot continue having approval processes in that level. Lastly, what was also one of the conclusions is, going forward, we should be pivoting towards results and learning orientation. It is time for the GCF to shift from an approval orientation towards emphasis on true learning and results. And that can be done with a more coherent architecture for managing for results and risks in the GCF2 period. I stop here. Thank you very much. I hope I have not been too negative in my presentation, but thanks for that.
Okay. Many thanks for that, Andreas. I think not only have you summarized the evaluation so far, you've also given us a sneak peek of what's coming up with the second performance review. We look forward to it coming up soon. I think maybe around the end of the year. Hopefully we will see that. It's a good segue because the issue of evaluation is going to be the topic of the next speaker, panel member Unica. So for Unica, what is the role of accredited entity-led evaluations and the Secretariat-led evaluations in adaptive management? And how is the Secretariat learning from accredited entity-led evaluations?
Thank you, Jerry, for those very interesting questions. And good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here as a part of this esteemed panel. So onto these 2 questions that Jerry posed, and to me, these are closely interrelated. So I'd like to try to answer them in one fell swoop. But if I fail, please bear with me, because there are quite a lot of things to unpack in those seemingly simple questions. So I guess, as Jerry said, Andreas's speech is already a good segue to what I'm going to say. But let me please unpack a little bit more the evaluation typology within the GCF. And the typology is actually quite simple. It's just based on who is leading the evaluation. So it does what it says on the tin, if you like. So most of us will be aware that the IEU's bread and butter are independent evaluations. And we've heard from Andreas some findings and lessons from their synthesis and evaluative work. But in the GCF, based on the evaluation policy that was approved in May 2022, that came into effect in May 2022, the policy also provides for 2 other types of evaluation. The first is the accredited entity-led evaluation, and most of you will be familiar with the interim and final evaluations that are required to be submitted as part of a funded activity. And the second are the Secretariat-led evaluation, evaluations. And this second type is more prospective because the Secretariat is really just at the early stages of thinking about the processes and also the pilot topics that will be evaluated. And really with this typology, this three types of evaluation, I would say that the GCF is uniquely positioned within the broader climate finance and perhaps even development architecture because of this policy provision. But here I can see some thought bubbles popping up in the room, and I could tell that some of you are wondering and asking, but is there really a need for Secretariat-led evaluations? What is the value add of such evaluations when the IEU and the accredited entities are already undertaking them plenty? So what is really the value addition of Secretariat-led evaluations? And before I deep dive into this question, again, allow me to backtrack and say a little bit more about what the Secretariat does when it receives an accredited entity-led evaluation, either an interim or a final evaluation. So what happens is that upon submission, some lucky Secretariat staff will be brought in to undertake the review of these reports. And normally, the reviews will be undertaken by a combination of a portfolio manager or a restructuring specialist and a monitoring and evaluation specialist. So this two staff will be bringing in a combination of in-depth knowledge of the funded activity and evaluative thinking and framing into the review. And together, they shape the feedback that the Secretariat provide to the accredited entity on that particular evaluation. So at this stage or level of maturity of the GCF portfolio, there are two types of lessons that the Secretariat is able to generate from the review process so far. The first type of lesson is related or is very much project specific, and they usually pertain to the implementation challenges or the barriers to achieving the intended results, and in some cases, even restructuring needs. So they very much speak to what Keith earlier alluded to, the challenges, for instance, that they faced because of the pandemic on the disruption of the supply chain. So these evaluations, when we read them while reviewing, they become a platform for discussion between the Secretariat and the accredited entity. And I would say that this is where adaptive management usually comes into action. And the second type of lessons that we're generating from the reviews of accredited entity-led evaluations relate to evaluation processes, the challenges and opportunities that accredited entities face when delivering the interim or final evaluations. And this will speak to, some of the challenges that Karen alluded to earlier, for instance, wondering about, the framework or the requirements of the GCF in the, as it regards the evaluations. And 2 points have so far come out quite strongly under this type of lesson. First is that there is a clear need to have a shared understanding between the AE and the Secretariat on what exactly is required and expected of these evaluations. And here, I think the GCF is making good progress. The evaluation policy is already in force. The evaluation standards, thanks to the IEU, has been finalized and published. And the Secretariat is well underway in producing the evaluation operational guidelines and procedures that will clearly set out the quality expectations as well as recommended step-by-step process that the accredited entities can follow. And I mean, we accept in the Secretariat that this could have come earlier and perhaps could have answered some of the questions that GIZ had on, is this parallel to the OECD DAC requirements or not? Simple questions like that. But we are making progress in this area. And the second point that came out strongly under the evaluation process related lessons pertain to capacity. The truth is the GCF is working with varying levels of evaluation capacity. And this informs the Secretariat's thinking when it comes to, how the strategy for evaluation capacity building should look like. And again, and similar to the evaluation operational guidelines and procedures, this is an ongoing process. And this is a work in progress. So at this stage, I would like to circle back to the question that I left hanging earlier. What is the value addition of a Secretariat-led evaluation when it comes to adaptive management? So based on the two types of lessons that I just discussed, you probably are now thinking that, yes, the Secretariat is able to glean on some lessons and findings from the accredited entity-led evaluations, but they are highly project specific, and the Secretariat often has additional information and analytical requirements to fulfill its monitoring and evaluation role. And perhaps, an example of this to connect this back to adaptive management is the Secretariat would probably want at some point to internally look at, the extent to which its processes, systems, and tools are facilitating or not adaptive management. And this is an empirical question that might be best answered by an evaluation with its rigor and impartiality. So with this, I'd like to also just be a bit more forward-looking, because I think this is the blessing of coming in last to be hopeful and plant seeds of hope moving forward. So as the GCF portfolio matures and more evaluations come through to the Secretariat, the hope really is that there will be more joint learning in the future, more reflections and conversations on what really has been working, and probably even on what hasn't been working too well. And I guess this speaks to Andreas's last consideration on, being more learning oriented as an organization, because as already mentioned in other sessions and as well as by other panel members, there is urgency to achieve climate impacts, the climate impacts that the GCF intends to achieve. And that requires that we learn quickly and adapt effectively. And robust evaluations, we believe, are a good tool, a good and powerful tool to achieve that. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Philippa, for that. I think that together with Andreas's explanation, we have a better view of the lessons from evaluations. We now move to questions. We have questions from Huva. I'll read the first one. And then after this, we'll open the floor to the participants in the room. So please, if you have any questions, you can think about them now. The first question from Huva says, how long does it take to introduce change, especially when it requires board approval? I'm assuming it means major change. So anybody from the Secretariat want to take that?
Yes, so indeed, the process of change approval would be different for a change request that does not require board approval, and would be different for so-called minor changes or non-major changes that are being approved within the Secretariat. And it can take anywhere from a month for simple requests like extending completion or closing deadline, or providing a waiver for any of the conditions included in the FIA that are not board imposed, well, up to several months for changes that do require board approval. And the reason for this, the latter one being taking so long, is that basically any change request that needs to go to the board is deemed major. And by that we mean that we need to undertake a very thorough review of the background of the request and of the considerations that led to the AE requesting a change like that, of that scope and majority. And also the level of assessment and the documents that need to feed into this assessment would typically take much longer to be prepared and analyzed by the Secretariat than it would be in the case of a minor change. In general, we would assess that major change would have to be approved within 180 days, if I remember correctly. That's the service standard we want to achieve, but this is being counted from the moment when the full request change package is being submitted to the Secretariat.
Okay, many thanks for that. We have another question from Huba. This one is, in fact, we have two more questions from Huba. The second question is, enhanced direct access, EDA, is one of the more innovative and critical funding windows for supporting frontline communities. What has been the progress here and how can it be improved? I don't know if anybody from Secretariat would have a view on EDA. I don't know also if IEU have evaluated EDA. Andreas, have you evaluated? I think you evaluated RFPs, and EDA is one of them.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. In the meantime, until somebody from the Secretariat may take this, to shed some light to this, we have looked at the request for proposal as being one of the windows for which we can be more supply driven rather than demand driven as a fund. Here we've seen that there are 4 requests for proposals that are very different in the setup, and our evaluation report hinted at exactly that question on how was the setup done for the different RFPs. And you may, for instance, compare the RED Plus, the RFP for RED Plus results-based payment, which was quite successful in its implementation, as it was quite well linked to the UNFCCC processes with regards to RED Plus. And there was a clear need for the GCF to step into this place and space. Versus some considerations such as the enhanced direct access request for proposal program, pilot program. And here we found that there was very limited uptake, with only 2 projects resulting from the engagement on the enhanced direct access window. So you have to imagine it takes the fund quite some time and quite a lot of resources to put up a request for proposal, to get a dedicated processing window for that, and then also to have the staff to look at these processes and to attend to these requests for proposals that are coming in. So the issue has been then the question of, is this indeed useful for the fund and useful for the partners that are applying for such? And here we found that essentially RFPs are not yet overcoming the challenges, the general challenges that we're perceiving with the business model of the GCF. So basically you find yourself in exactly the same process as you would be with a normal FP. There's no difference in the process itself. It's basically an additional step in the process, which created very lengthy processes, often unclarity around who could apply for those. So how can one get accredited while as well going for one of the RFPs? So that were some of the key aspects that we found of why it hadn't worked as well as other RFPs. But maybe that, I stop here, maybe that helps.
Indeed, there's only very few, as you noted, only 2, I think, approved to maybe even observe the issues. I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions from the floor. Do you have any questions? If you could raise your hand, we could bring the mic to you. Okay, there is somebody from the back, the gentleman from the back. If you could kindly introduce yourself before you ask your question.
OK. Merci. Si vous permettez, je vais m'exprimer en français pour mieux me faire comprendre. Je suis Nebida Lamek Kaboré du Burkina Faso. J'ai juste 3 questions d'éclaircissement. Vous avez parlé de gestion évolutive dans le cadre du GCF. Je voudrais mieux comprendre. Est-ce à dire que si j'ai mon projet Fonds vert climat et que le projet se met en œuvre, il peut y arriver que, en fonction des réalités du terrain, on veuille modifier certaines activités. Est-ce que c'est ce que ça veut dire? On peut laisser tomber certaines activités pour intégrer d'autres activités et le secrétariat va accepter cela. Deuxièmement, vous avez parlé de mécanisme de gestion des plaintes et des recours. Est-ce à dire que pour les projets Fonds vert climat, au même titre en annexe où je dois avoir un plan de sauvegarde environnementale et sociale, un plan genre, il faut que le projet, tout projet soit accompagné d'un mécanisme de gestion des plaintes et recours ou bien c'est par projet spécifique. Et enfin, l'avant-dernier panéliste a dit que le temps d'accréditation a augmenté. Qu'est-ce qui explique cela? Parce que pour nous, avec l'expérience, ce temps-là devrait être plus court parce qu'effectivement, est-ce à dire que les entités qui ont été accréditées, le secrétariat n'est pas, ou le conseil d'administration n'est pas satisfait de leur travail et c'est ça qui justifie pour que le temps soit plus long pour l'accréditation. Je veux mieux comprendre. Je vous remercie.
Okay, many thanks for that. I think it's 3 questions. The extent of change, what kind of change can be made, whether specific elements can be removed, and so on. Second one is, I think it's related to redress mechanism, maybe it's for friction. And third is on relation to accreditation, the length of accreditation, whether that is a reflection of how we observe the implementation, or whether our implementation observation affects accreditation. So maybe anybody from the panel want to take the first one in terms of change? Yes, please.
So thank you for that question. That's a very valid one. How do we assess how a change request needs to be approached? Whether this is something that the AE can approve themselves, or is it something that needs to be consulted and approved by the Secretariat or possibly by the board? So a very practical approach I would recommend is to start bottom to start at the biggest kind of change that is possibly triggered, the major change, and first assess whether, based on the policy on restructuring and cancellation, whether the change that is going to be introduced can possibly trigger a major change. And it's important to note that the policy on restructuring and cancellation refers to the word likely to trigger a major change. So anything that is likely to fall under the category of a major change would definitely and absolutely require a consultation with the Secretariat. And then you would have received guidance on how to take things forward. Then the second level of analysis and considerations you may want to have when assessing this kind of request is to see what type of obligations and what type of covenants are included in the funded activity. So definitely anything that would have effect on the impact of the project, on the objectives and outcomes that are listed in the log frame of the project, would need to be considered by the Secretariat. And anything that would require any type of amendment under the FAA, be it, for example, an extension of the completion time or reallocation of budget, this type of changes need to be considered by the Secretariat and need to be formalized in the form of a change request or a restructuring proposal. So having eliminated these 2 types of requests, we are left with something that most likely would require a consultation. So unless you are certain that type of changes you want to introduce do not fall under any of the 2 categories I have mentioned before, you may want to see the funding proposal and whether introducing the changes you want to make would impact the way the project was structured under the funding proposal and the way the project was defined under the funding proposal, because this is the type of analysis and assessment the Secretariat would be doing when assessing the change request or when assessing whether a change request should have been put forward for the Secretariat's consideration. In any case, as already mentioned during my panel presentation, the GCF focal point is there to assist you in having this kind of assessment. And I strongly advise to have this consultation to avoid situations in which changes to projects are being introduced and then are being submitted for approval retrospectively, because as already mentioned, this is neither good for the adaptive management process as this excludes the dialogue part I've been trying to stress. And it's also not good for the accredited entity as it may have severe consequences in case the GCF decides not to approve. I hope this has answered your question, and I'm happy to take this further offline. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks. So, Raksha, did you get the second question on redress?
Yes, I did. I can provide a quick clarification. For all accredited entities and as part of any accreditation agreement with the GCF, it is a requirement that the institution has a grievance redress mechanism. So if you are already accredited with the GCF or seeking accreditation, and on an institutional level, a grievance redress mechanism is required. Now, whether a project requires a grievance redress mechanism is ultimately depends on the accredited entity. Sometimes in the context of direct access entities, being both the executing entity as well as the accredited entity with the GCF, you may only have one project. In which case, if the policies and procedures of your institutional grievance mechanism are sufficient to address concerns, are commensurate to the scale of the project and the risks that might come up, then that it may be a decision for the accredited entity that the institutional grievance mechanism is the first point of contact. Just moving back, their accredited entities are different in size and shape, and grievance mechanisms can similarly be as diverse. An example of a grievance mechanism that we have heard is, for example, staff that are available in a cafe that is frequented by laborers in a project, where they are collecting grievances and listening to people in that cafe where they take their breaks. That's a way in which grievance mechanisms can operate. It doesn't have to always be a formal complaints form, but what is essential is that there is policies, that a mechanism exists, and that it is predictable, it's transparent, and it's accessible. But accredited entities do have the capacity to decide the level of the various levels and channels with which project level grievances are handled. On the IRM side, we do not discriminate. If a complainant wants to use both mechanisms, that's fine. We can collaborate. We can come to an understanding. It's really just key, regardless of scale, that these mechanisms are actually effective, they operate independently, and are accessible to people.
Okay, many thanks for that. Mindful of the time, the last question of the gentleman, Andreas, you want to take it very briefly?
Yeah.
Because there's still questions pending.
Yeah, okay. Very, very briefly, thank you very much for the question. Again, there are many possible scenarios of why the median accreditation time has increased or in the GCF1 period. Possible reasons that were identified with some stakeholders looked at the question of changed requirements for accreditation with new policies that were approved by the GCF board that would subsequently also be required by the accredited entity, and that may increase processing times depending of where the accreditation, where the candidate for accreditation may be in the process of accreditation. Secondly, I should also clarify that obviously the data that we're looking is that data of candidates that have been accredited within the period. So we're talking about 1,100 days when we first did the review in 2019. We're looking at 1,300 now. That means that you're obviously looking at a process that takes up to 4 years, or on average 4 years. So we need to have an understanding that obviously that is a long process, and that may be accredited entities that have tried to be accredited and had applied for accreditation earlier as well in the IRM period. A third reason is coming to the question of capacity and the accredited entities that we're dealing with. So the fast track, those that have been vetted by other organizations such as the Adaptation Fund and the GEF, were the initial group that was accredited very early on, as well as several direct access entities, thinking about CSE in Senegal as being one of the first ones in Africa being accredited in 2016. So what I'm saying is that the accredited entities or the partners that would like to partner with us now through accreditation may not be the standard organizations that we're looking at. So that's the difference. Thank you.
I think we've been blinking in red that our time has run out. Any last words from Keith, Karen, and Albert? Any last parting words, maybe a short word that you would like to impart to our participants?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. And maybe just to say that obviously the lessons learned from implementation requires the implementing partner to be flexible in their approaches and seek out innovative and out-of-the-box type approaches to deal with challenges that are confronted, particularly those that are not anticipated.
Thank you for that, Keith. Karen?
Yeah, for me, it was really helpful to hear the different approaches, how to deal with changes. And I think it would be very good if we would have a bit more predictability so that we can foresee how to implement.
Thank you. Albert?
Thank you, Jerry. I guess what I would like to reiterate here is just our availability to partner with our counterparties and stakeholders. The overall goal really is to achieve a climate impact, and what we want to be able to do is assist that by instilling integrity values in GCF funded activities. So we do appreciate you reaching out to us, and we will look forward to working with you. Thank you.
Many thanks, everybody. I would like to recognize that there are 3 more questions. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I would encourage our speakers to kindly read them because they're very valuable and insightful. And if we really had more time, I would have hoped that we would answer them. And they're very interesting. They're in Huba, so kindly please read them. But with that, I don't want to delay the next session. So we would like to thank our panel members for this very, very interesting discussion. And I think if there's one thing I take away from this, is that there is a lot of scope for us to learn so that the next processes are actually improved, because we as a learning institution need to learn from all of this. There's a lot of insights. And although I'm taking notes, I hope that we could gather them all and put it in a process by which we actually roll it into the next generation of projects that we are developing. So with that, I would like to ask our audience to please give a round of applause to our panelists, and thank you very much for your active engagement today. Thank you.